This podcast is made possible by your support and your donations. Thank you. And by the purchase of my book called Everyday Buddhism, Real-Life Buddhist Teachings and Practices for Real Change. I will post an affiliate link to the book on Amazon in the show notes. And if you've already read it, please take a minute to rate and review. And also consider purchasing it again for a friend or family member as a gift. Welcome to Everyday Buddhism, making every day better by applying the proven tools found in Buddhist concepts. Welcome to episode 115 of Everyday Buddhism, Making Every Day Better. I am delighted to have another conversation with James Kruse, a return guest who I hope will be returning again and again in the future. In this episode, James is joining me for a conversation about his book, Unlocking the Heart, Writing for Mindfulness, Courage, and Self-Compassion. James is the author of the essay collection, Kindness Will Save the World, and editor of several best-selling poetry anthologies, including The Wonder of Small Things, which was the winner of the New England Book Award. He also is the editor of Healing the Divide, The Path to Kindness, also a winner of the Nautilus Books for a Better Life Award, and How to Love the World, which has over 140,000 copies in print. James has been featured in NPR's Morning Edition and in People magazine, the Boston Globe, the New York Times Magazine, the Sun Magazine, and the Washington Post. He is the author of 5 prize-winning books of poetry, including Unlocking the Heart, and his poems have appeared in Ploughshares, the New Republic, and other journals. James lives with his husband in the woods of southern Vermont. And at the end of September, James surprised me with the gift of his book, Unlocking the Heart. And what a gift it was. I'll talk more about this in our conversation, but the book really did help unlock my heart. During February, and a time of reflection on my transformative experience after falling and time in the hospital in December, I worked with the book. I mean, really worked with the book, reflecting on the poems and James's thoughts about them, and using the writing prompts to journal. This helped me be open to vulnerability, and it helped me being held by the poems in the book. That was also the gift James gave me. As you will no doubt hear, James is a gentle soul whose conversation about poetry, spirituality, and life is healing. Both the words he uses and the tender way he speaks them is a balm for our painful and anxious times. Among other things, we talked about how we are all poets. And as James said, we are all going around having moments, and those moments are asking for expression. We talked about how our materially focused culture has caused us to be separated from spiritual practice, and poetry can help us build a practice if we keep showing up. And we talked about how writing poetry is about noticing and giving space to what you're noticing, which is a mindfulness practice in itself. And reading poetry trains you in this practice of noticing. Take some time to ease into this episode. I promise you will be soothed and come away craving more poetry in your life. The conversation starts now. Well, with me today is James Kruse. James is a repeat guest And I hope to be a continuing repeat guest. I know he's got another book coming out. So, you know, when that happens, then we can talk about that coming on again and talking again because I love excuses to talk about poetry. I love excuses to talk with James because he's such a beautiful soul. And so, thank you, James.
Well, thank you, Wendy. You too are a beautiful soul, and I will take any reason to talk to you again.
Okay. Well, we can start inventing them if you don't keep releasing books or
That's
something.
right.
Um, because you're a repeat guest and been preparing for this, I was afraid I was going to repeat like the same outline, the same concepts, and I mean it's easy to do that, but I don't want to do that. But just as a tag to my listeners, James was on episode 98. We were talked about his book, The Wonder of Small Things. So I encourage my listeners, if you didn't already, or if you'd like to hear it again, go back and listen to episode 98 because hopefully we're not going to repeat too much. I think it might happen, but I'm going to try to focus on a slightly different slant about things today. Um, so I decided not to listen to that episode before
Mm.
I prepared for you. I also decided not to look at the notes that I had for that episode because I wanted to come fresh. And so my thought about what sort of the focus of today's conversation, and I obviously we're not. I'm not like training you to say this is what we have to talk about, but you know me. It's organic. We go where we go.
Mhm.
But I want to talk about you, James, as a poet. I want to talk about what makes a good poet or what makes a good poem.
Mm.
And I want to talk about the poet as healer.
Mm.
Because I shared a little of my story with James before we started recording, and my podcast listeners know because I plugged my Substack book. But the poet as healer, the healer of himself when he's writing the poem, when he's thinking about the poem or the images or the feelings, and the healer, the poet as healer to those who are readers. Um, so those are kind of the areas I want to go at. And so I shared a bit in the introduction about how this book was important medicine to me, playing a major part in escorting me through a transformative awakening experience. Now, that sounds real dramatic, but it really was. Um, Probably one of the biggest transformative experiences I've had in all my 72 years. So,
Mm.
um, I'm trying not to be overly dramatic here, but your book and its practices in openness and vulnerability served as, I'll call it my bodhisattva of grace.
Mm.
I had a grace experience, but I needed a bodhisattva to escort me through the other end. So that was you.
Mm.
Um, I'll share a brief bit of the story as we continue, but to kick it off, I'd like to read from the book's foreword by the poet and spiritual teacher Mark Nepo, who shines a light on what makes a poet, because that was my question. What makes a
Mm.
poet? Well, he writes a little bit about you and what makes a poet. I edited it a little, but this is the essence of it. James Cruz is a clear and tender poet. He is in the lineage of those who believe that we are all poets when loved or worn into being authentic. This is poetry that sustains us because the life of expression is constantly healing. This opens everyone to a deeper practice than just arranging words on a page. This is the poetry that rises from the inner life to shape the outer life.
Mm.
This is the poetry that saves each of us each time we stumble and fall.
Mm.
So let's dive deep.
Mm.
James, are we all poets?
I believe that we are all poets. I mean, I think that we get to choose how deeply we engage in the practice of being poets. And to me, I think being a poet is really, Mark Nepo in his foreword talks about these pieces in Unlocking the Heart being like lyrical thresholds, which I love because I do think that every poem written is a doorway more deeply into a moment. So, I think we're all poets because we all are alive on this planet together.
Yeah.
And I think we're all poets because we're going around having moments. That's all we really have. We're just having moments
Moment.
by ourselves with each other. And we're holding on to certain moments. Certain moments come back to us. And I feel very blessed to have a kind of daily practice where, I wake up in the morning, sometimes obscenely early, much earlier than I would like, but I just surrender to it. Okay, I'm awake. It's 3 a.m. I don't really want to be awake. Um, and just really give myself over to the page. I mean, with a very strong cup of coffee usually, and then open my notebook and just see what will come. And oftentimes, what comes is a moment from the past that I didn't expect to remember or hold on to. Um, One of those moments from the book is, um, this moment I had with my father just before he passed away. And, I was struggling to come out to him as a queer man. And he, you know, basically gave me this sense of acceptance and embraced who I was without even saying the words. He just poured me this glass of orange
Orange
juice
juice. I love
because I
that.
had been a 20-year-old and stayed out too late the night before drinking, all of that. And it was just this tender moment that came back to me, decades later, actually. And I realized we all have these moments, whether they happened earlier today or yesterday, or whether they happened 10, 20 years ago, however long, those moments are still with us. They're still living in our body. And I believe that they are still asking for, craving expression somehow. Now, how we express those moments might be through conversation, might be through journaling. My chosen form of expression is poetry. And I feel really heartened that I feel like poetry is having a moment. So, I don't feel so alone in that being my mode of expression, that people are really turning to poetry, both the reading of it and the practicing of it, in order to, dive into the deep, just as you invited us into, Wendy.
Yeah. So tell me, is poetry having a moment? I mean, you know better than I know. Is because I've always thought poetry was like, a buried jewel. So, but is it the stress of our times? You think people are turning to poetry?
I do, yeah. It does seem to be having a moment to me. I
Well,
think,
you're having a moment, maybe.
well, yes, maybe. I do think poetry is having a moment too, but I want to kind of hit on something that you were talking about when you were laying out the outline. I think healing poems are having a moment right now because of the stress of our times. So, for those of us who maybe see poetry as both a mode of expression and a healing apparatus for our whole world, I think people are really gravitating toward that message, in part because we as a culture, as a world, have become a little separated from spiritual practice and
Yeah.
spirituality and what that means. And yet, poetry sort of is this open door for a lot of people. It's maybe not as intimidating as it used to be if it's written in an accessible way. And so people are really finding their way into, let's say, a healing kind of poetry and are really embracing that, I believe, as a way of living, as a way of living their lives and maybe coming back alive to those moments that I was talking about earlier that are just, always waiting in daily life. There are just all these moments that are waiting for us to kind of reach out and grab onto.
But we have to notice them, and that's part of
Yes.
the practice, and that's what makes it a spiritual practice. It's a mindfulness practice with bling, right?
Right. I love that. I
It's
love that. Yes.
because
Poetry's the bling.
poetry is the bling, right? But you to get the poem, you'll have to notice, right?
Yeah.
those moments, and you have to notice, the wind bowing the trees, and you have to notice all of that stuff. And
Yeah.
um most, I'm hoping more people are having a moment with this. Actually, I think about that now. I think in the last few years I've seen more poetry being shared on like Facebook and stuff than I ever did before. Like it all started with Mary Oliver, I think, or something. I don't
Mhm.
know. But it's a lot of different people, and I didn't know whether it was just because it's the kind of people I follow, or is it really a sort of a universal thing? I didn't know
Yeah.
our cultural thing anyway. So yeah,
Yeah.
I love that it's having a moment. So I'm glad that you feel that it's not just your moment, but it's poetry's moment as well. But I
Yeah.
like that you're having a moment.
Yeah.
So how did let's get personal here about
Sure.
you as how did you how did you become a poet? How did you shape yourself to be a poet?
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about your journey. A lot of people when they're in like high school or grade, they write poetry, but then,
Mhm.
they don't do anything again with it. But how does one become a poet, right? Like
Yeah.
instead of just jotting down little silly rhymes when you're in high school.
Well, I started with those silly rhymes, first of all. And I tell this story a little bit in the introduction. So I had an amazing third grade teacher, Mrs. Sharon Brown, and she was giving us poetry. She was exposing us to different cultures all over the world, like doing this unit on Thailand and performing in The King and I and reading the play. And she was just like, I didn't know it at the time, of course, but one of the most amazing teachers that I
Yeah,
would
she
ever have.
sounded wonderful. Yeah.
Just amazing. And, so we had this kind of show and tell unit that wasn't just show and tell. She sort of invited us to do other things too. Like if you have a talent, if you want to showcase some part of yourself. And so I mean, I was a very, very shy kid. So I don't even know how I worked up the gumption to, go up to her desk and ask, "Hey, Mrs. Brown, I would really like to write a poem or write poems and share those with the rest of the class during show and tell. Do you think that would be okay? I would love to just like have a movie of this so I could see like my face turning every shade of red,
Right.
embarrassed, like barely able to speak, this little whisper of a kid saying these things. And to her immense credit, she was just so enthusiastic. And no one had ever been enthusiastic before with the idea of me writing something. And I think right away that fire was lit. And so, I wish I still had my very first poem. I remember it was called Ode to Summer. That's all I remember. And it was the silly rhymes, I'm sure. I loved summer because I was free from school. I was, free to have the spacious days that I really adored. And so I wrote about that and shared it with the class, again, probably turning every shade of red. And afterwards, people were coming up to me and like, I can't believe you wrote that. Wow. Giving me that positive feedback. And I think
Hmm.
Mrs. Brown did the same thing. And so again, like more fuel for the fire, more fuel for the fire. And I must have I have this memory of, lying across my parents' huge four-poster bed, which is kind of where we would gather sometimes and just chat, talk about life, and working on poems, So I think it just became something that I did, something about, poetry really called to me. And so I made it a part of my daily life. And like anyone else, I started thinking, well, I better be more practical. So I should
Yeah.
probably, go to school, learn to be a teacher. But there have been all of these times in my life where that practicality, because I grew up very poor. And so the need, the drive to have, an income, a way to make
Right.
money was really strong for me and a way to take care of my family because they were still quite poor too. And so even up to my last year of high school, I thought, well, I'm going to go into international business because I really wanted to learn French so that I'll go into international business
Oh
and
yeah,
study
that makes
French.
perfect sense.
Right? It
Yeah.
just totally adds up. Yeah. And so this was known, I guess, to my teachers. And then I remember writing this essay about, I don't know, a short story or something. And again, one of my teachers, she gave me this like amazing glowing feedback. And she said, great job, Mr. International Business. And then wrote this thing that changed my life, which is, I really hope you will consider studying English because I think you have a gift. And I'm getting teary just talking about it because
Really?
it's just someone saying, like, giving you that encouragement, that heart. Like, this could be a path for you. You could teach it. You could do something, that would be quote unquote practical, but also pursue this deeper love for you. And so that changed everything. So then I'm like, okay, fine. I'm going to study English. I'm going to sign up for the creative writing classes. I signed up for this crazy, novel class that I realized was far too advanced for me, but like I didn't want to drop it. I just wanted to take all these classes that were, opening up these pathways in my brain. And I think throughout college, I just kept doing that and really kept following it. It was just a part of my everyday life. And so I didn't really grow up with any sort of spiritual underpinning religious practice. So this really became my practice of being present, being mindful, and noticing my life around me. My father died very suddenly when I was 20 years old, and so then that also became a way of healing myself and processing the grief um, through the poetry that I was reading and encountering. And still very, very blessed and lucky to have all these amazing teachers along the way. And I guess it was not really until, later on in life, I have this very dear friend of mine. Her name is Kim. And, she's always been very committed to Buddhism, really interested in Buddhism and reading all these books. And I was just visiting her and her wife one day in Minneapolis. And she just, I don't know, it was another one of these moments of real change. And she just said, okay, so we're going to do like something for ourselves. We're going to do some self-care. So she held up these two DVDs back when we still used those. And she said, I have yoga here or meditation. Which one do you want to do? And I said, I think I want to do meditation. So I'd never meditated at all, ever. And we sat and meditated together. And something about that, even though it was extremely uncomfortable, and I thought, I'm doing it wrong, I'm doing it wrong, I'm doing it
Of
wrong.
course, everybody does.
That's what we always think, right? Um, Something about that really lit a fire for me, on the other side of the writing practice. And so I think ever since then, and the spiritual practice has grown and I've built prayer into it as well. But it's like meditation, it's all these different aspects of what I feel like are the same practice, which is really
Yeah.
noticing, that word that you brought into it, Wendy. It's noticing and giving space to what is noticed. I think we can notice things, but we have to also give space to what is noticed.
Yeah.
And the meditation has helped with that. The writing has helped with that. And, any of these other practices that have come in have also helped.
No, I know from reading your poetry, you've had jobs you didn't like.
Yeah.
You pushed through, you did what you had to do to, eat and have rent and whatever. But in the end, you know, you sort of did reach a mark. You're having a moment, I guess, um, that you're known.
Mhm.
You're a viable poet. I mean, and I
Yeah.
don't know how often you stop and think about that, but um, the struggle is real when you're trying to pursue a dream like that. And sometimes dreams like you have these dreams, but you go do your life stuff, right, that you have to do, and then all of a sudden you find yourself in a dream. Some people just find themselves in their dream thing. They don't have to work so hard. Did you, as you were doing life and still probably having your writing practice, did you ever really, really, really think that you would be a well-known published poet? And you probably are going to say I'm not a well-known published poet, but yeah, you know what I mean.
I do know what you mean. And actually, I do take time sometimes to think about it because, the way that people talk about me now and the way that I get invited to do things and it's very surreal because I never really thought, I guess I hoped that I would reach this level, but I never actually thought that I would do so. And I never expected that it would be through lifting up other people's work. That's how a lot of people
Yeah,
first came to know me is through
the
my
editing. Yeah,
editing of anthologies and sharing many people's poems through social media and things like that. And so it's interesting that that has been part of my path because it took me a while to, I still love uplifting other people's voices. I have a new anthology that'll be out soon. Um, but it took me a while to say, oh, it's okay to uplift your own work too. And
yeah.
this book, Unlocking the Heart, was sort of bursting out of the gate with like, okay, these are all my favorite poems. These are the poems that feel like old friends to me. And not only do I want to give people poems, but I want to give them these reflections that I write. I
Which
do
I
a
love, by the way. We have to talk about
thank
those.
you. I
Those are
really
all
appreciate that.
they're almost as brilliant as the poetry.
Oh,
Well, as far as touching you and making things make sense, and
yeah.
also they have poetry in them in the way you explain things. It's hard to explain to people who maybe haven't read your work like that, like the weekly pause or whatever. But
Yeah.
it is amazing. I mean, those reflections I have yellow highlights on like
Well, those come from the heart, and I do that for my weekly newsletter that you just mentioned, the weekly pause. Every single week, it's this deal that I've made with myself that even if it's just a little paragraph or a few lines, I'm going to write a little bit of prose and a writing prompt that goes along with the poem that I share each week. And, some weeks are easier than others.
I get it.
Some weeks they come the morning of, and it's like, I can't believe that came to me this morning. But anyway, the unlocking the heart was really me saying, okay, there's value in my own work. And, I've kind of, made part of my career and a name by editing these anthologies. And I want people to know that being a poet is a huge part of who I am, that I'm still being a poet even as I'm editing anthologies and putting them together. Um, so it is surreal. It is strange. I have had to work an incredible amount to get to this point.
Oh yeah.
And, I think the lucky thing was that I did have the meditation practice as an underpinning in everything that I was doing. Because for me, what I've had to do with writing is basically in line with what I've done with my meditation practice. You just keep showing up. You show up every day, even when you don't want to, even when you think it's going to be awful, it almost always is better than you think. Occasionally it's worse, that happens.
Yeah.
We can't sugarcoat it at all, but just continually showing up, no matter what the stories are, going
That you're
through
telling
one's head.
yourself. Yeah,
Exactly.
exactly.
So I just keep showing up, and I think I do smile a little that you say I'm having a moment. I agree, that does feel true. And at the same time, when I kind of zoom out, it all feels part of the flow. That I'm surprised at the abundance just as much as anybody else might be. And at the same time, it's like, well, I show up every day. It doesn't mean I write something that's shareable or viable every day. But when you do kind of make it a practice to show up as much as you can, it's amazing how that the incremental actions really add up to something much larger.
Yeah, that's a that's a testimony to both meditation practice and writing practice. I mean, for
Yes.
sure. It's like I've been really, you know, I always sort of wanted to be a writer. I had that secret goal ever since I was a kid, and my teachers encouraged me, similar sort of thing.
Mm.
And, when I was in high school, I was in original oration where I would write and present stuff in the National Forensic League, which I don't even know if they have that anymore. But the point is that I got sidetracked and had other jobs, and I went into broadcasting and all that. But the writing thing was always there,
Mm.
but I didn't show up.
Mm.
I didn't show up. I've been
Yeah.
brilliant at showing up for meditation because I got um, uh, wooed and fell in love with Buddhism, and then that became my my calling, if you will. So after I was able to retire from I was writing then. I was writing resumes and marketing material for career
Right.
people. It's still writing, but blah.
Yeah.
So, but but when I retired from that job, I focused more on my Buddhist practice and
Mm.
Buddhist teaching, and then the podcast came along, and so. But I didn't keep writing except for the podcast, But I think it's still practice. It's
It
just not the
is.
way you're talking about showing up every day to pour your heart out. I think you sparked me with this book to
Mm.
be open and vulnerable and write not just how to stuff, right? Not,
That's
okay, this is how to meditate. This is what the Eightfold Path is about. You know what I
right.
mean? It's a very different thing.
Yeah.
So you're a great teacher in that way.
Mm.
Um, Definitely. I haven't participated in your community group around the weekly pause to learn from you directly, although I still feel like I've learned from you directly just
Yeah.
by being a fan of your work and your books. But I wanted to share with listeners what a motivating and insightful teacher you are through the weekly pause emails. And you hinted at this before, so I wanted to kind of give them the background here.
Mhm.
That you offer a poem, and then you write a prose few paragraphs, which is insight about how the poem came to be. What does it mean to you? What could it mean to me as a reader, and so forth. And then you offer a writing prompt, and um, the writing prompts are great because it's a way that you could build a habit, a practice of
Mhm.
journaling. And then that raw, rough journal material could actually be crafted into a poem if you wanted to and if you kept at it and you were committed. And in your book, it's structured in the same way as this weekly pause. It's
Mhm.
the poem, some insight, and then you say invitation for writing and reflection. And the book is formatted in 6 sections, which I think is kind of brilliant because people could read just the one section if that's where they are at the moment because it's courage and vulnerability, self-compassion and release, grief and healing, mindfulness and presence, gratefulness and joy, wonder and awe. So it's like I mean, I don't know what else there is left in the moments we have other than those things. Uh, so, but courage and vulnerability has been my favorite
Mhm.
and most productive space to work with due to how I am in myself and the world right now. And maybe a lot of other people too, because of the way sort of what's going on. Uh,
Yeah.
it's a hard world to look at. Um, I use these invitations to journal, and hopefully mine will be crafted into poetry someday. Now they're
Yeah.
just scribbles. Sometimes I see a spark of brilliance in there. Sometimes I think blah blah blah. But I find that this method works really well because it breaks down the walls of conceptualization and linear thinking,
Mm.
which is why I think you're a really good teacher. Um, like the words, I'll do a quote from one of my uh, journal entries that I wrote in response to your writing prompt from the first poem in your book. The very first poem was kintsugi, which is kintsugi is always been a favorite symbol and metaphor for me. Uh, because I practice in the Japanese tradition of Buddhism,
Mm,
so it's like I was very familiar with what that was. But in writing about the prompt, I said words come tumbling out of the breaks with the force of sunlight on an honest life, full of confusion, delusion, fear, and anger. And
mm,
I think that that's what you elicit from those prompts.
mm.
That words come tumbling out. You
Yes.
don't think about them. When I
Mm,
do your prompt, I don't think, oh, what does he want me to write? I just start writing, and it's like, there it comes, stuff comes. I don't know what it's going to be. So those are the mechanics that I've been using with your book. What steps or mechanics do you use to create a poem? Like little scraps of paper,
mm.
a journal, a smartphone, or and what methods do your students use as you
Mm.
work with them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say all of the above for me. It is scraps of paper. I bought these lovely little notebooks to keep like one in the car, one in every room of the house, just so I can kind of be present for whatever comes. Sometimes I will write in the notes of my phone. If I'm out for a walk, I'll put it on like airplane mode so I'm not, monkeying around with it. And then I'll go into the notes and, maybe write a little something. So I think it's just trying to be available for whatever comes, not expecting it, not forcing it. Most of my work probably comes through my notebook, my journal every morning,
Yeah.
and just the showing up for that. But it's not like I sit down and say, like, I will write a poem now, and something tumbles out. No, 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 no.
No, no.
Oftentimes I sit down and I think there is no way a poem, like nothing, an essay, nothing is coming today. And so I'll just write, what's going through my mind, who said this to me, that upset me, just kind of let it all out. I do kind of what Julia Cameron, the author of The Artist's Way, she
Yeah.
calls morning
Morning
pages.
pages. I
It's
did
just
that.
automatic
I,
writing,
Yeah,
right?
it's automatic writing. It is.
Yeah,
And some people even say that's channeling. I don't know who you're channeling, but it feels like channeling
it
sometimes because it's
does.
like, wait a minute, I didn't think that.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, people compare it to channeling, prayer, a form of meditation. I don't know really what to call it exactly, but something magical happens, I think, when you open yourself up. And really, it's opening yourself up to surprise and
Yeah.
without the pressure or expectation to produce anything,
Any.
period. And then the next step is to produce anything that is perfect, good, beautiful. Like it just really has to be true and it has to come from you. It can come through you. It may feel like it's coming from elsewhere, but I think that those are the only real things. It's just authentically you. And so opening yourself up to that is the best way of doing it. And that's what I recommend for my students too.
Really?
I kind of cut my teeth, started teaching English composition to, 18-year-old college students, and then, taught them a little poetry, snuck in some poetry sometimes too. And so I got really used to noticing when a poem would open them up. Occasionally I would share some of my own poems, I'd share poems by other people. And they loved when they could have almost like a mantra, like a little snippet from the poem that they could start with and then just run and go off on their own. So you'll see in this book and in the Weekly Pause newsletter, a lot of the prompts I offer are, if you feel stuck, start with this phrase, steal my first line, whatever works for you, because it'll become your own. It'll become your own thing, and it will lead you in places that will probably surprise you. But it helps to have this little like
Yeah.
spark, this little kind of opening that you can step through. Like I have this poem. It's actually not in this book. It's in a book that'll be out pretty soon. And it's called Say Yes. And the whole poem is just repeating, say yes to, say yes
Ah.
to, say yes to. And it is, I've done this exercise now with lots and lots of groups, like corporate groups, all these different kinds of people. And it unlocks amazing things every time. just say yes, because we don't always want to say yes to the deeper stuff, to
Right.
like what you're saying, the stuff that calls on our courage and our vulnerability. So if you have a very, gentle kind of guiding hand of a poem, which is how I think of a lot of my work, to kind of say, hey, this might be good for you. This might be a little healing. This might be a little fun. Let's see what happens.
Yeah.
And that just kind of opens it up.
Yeah, I like those little first line things that you can run with. Sometimes I start with it and then turn it into something else.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
sort of like take one word of it or whatever and turn it into
exactly.
something else. I shared a bit of how this book was important medicine for me, playing, and I told James more of this, a little more of the story at the beginning before we were recording, playing a major part in escorting me through a transformative awakening experience. A long story. I don't want to go into it here and take time from James, but I was awakened and healed from a 5 year long fear and hiding from COVID due to worry about my autoimmune condition. And after facing my worst fear of ending up in the hospital around the holidays, where viruses are at the peak, it was then I came through the fire, like your poem After the Fire um, speaks to. I didn't even call that out that we were going to read that today, but it just that's it. That did remind me of that experience
Yeah.
completely, and I found my courage because that's part of that section, courage, and a way out of anxious, self-focused, hyper vigilant, traumatic sort of experience. And it sparked me writing my second book, which my audience knows about, called Living Life as It Is, a personal narrative of my transformation through the pandemic, which I'm releasing as a Substack serial book. I'm not doing this to plug it. I'm doing this because I want people to know that it's amazing what reading something like this and using those writing prompts can open up for you. I had never thought to do that. Never
Mhm.
in a million years. And all
Yeah.
of a sudden, I just kept writing it. I said, "This is what I want to write,"
Yeah.
because you gave me the courage to just write what I wanted to write. So
Mm.
all of this is to say that it was working with your book that pushed me to write what I really wanted to write, even though I was frightened to tell the truth. I was embarrassed, and I felt completely open and vulnerable. So you can either read that poem now or you can just answer the question if you've had other experiences with students finding a new opening through these prompts and insights.
Mm. Well, thank you for sharing that, Wendy. And I'm just so honored that my book would have a part in just opening this door. And I want to say too, I think everyone should go and check out your Substack book. I know I'm going to
Oh,
after Wendy and I are done because I didn't know that this was happening. So I'm going to have to subscribe to Wendy's Substack. But also love the title. And actually, I have been working on a poem that starts with something that's similar. It starts, I don't want to listen to another podcast or read another book telling me how to have the life I want.
oh,
I
yeah,
just, I just want to love my life as it is.
as it is.
And then it just kind
Exactly.
of goes from there.
Well,
Yeah.
that's all from the first of the eightfold path in Buddhism is right view. And right view is people always ask me, what's the most important thing about Buddhism? And I always answer, seeing life as it is, not as you want it to be, not as you wish it wasn't. And that's it. And most of the time we go through our life wishing something to be or wishing something not to be,
That's right.
right? And,
That's
and
right.
it's only you only sort of become yourself when you live your life as it presents itself. Now, that doesn't mean it's all beautiful. It can
Mhm.
be pretty crappy, like ending up in the hospital. But then again, that's your life right then, and you've got
Right.
stuff to deal with. So yeah,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah. And your life is given to you. It's not like everything has something to teach you. I'm not quite sure that I agree with that. And it's our life is given to us as it is. And
Yeah.
so we work with that raw material. All right, I'll just go ahead and read this poem and then we can talk a little bit more.
Okay.
So this is called After the Fire. Let me endure whatever fires must pass through here, must scorch my skin. And if I have to feel the heat, let me also trust that, like the lodgepole pine, the fire will open the parts of me that are still closed tight, releasing seeds I've been clinging to, hoarding for years. Let me thrive in this new clearing made at the center of my life, seeing now how the necessary flames melted away my resistance, revealing all that once lay hidden, asleep inside me.
Yeah. Brilliant. That sort of was the poem for my whole winter, so thank you.
Right. And I'm
Uh,
so sorry that happened to you. And in a way, I was telling Wendy before we started that I have this phrase that I like to use for these moments of grace that come to us that, you can only look at them afterwards and say, oh, I'm kind of glad that happened, or that really
yeah.
opened me up in a new way. And I call that rough grace.
I
It's
love
not
rough
it's not
grace.
fun. It's not the like, angel wing coming down kind of grace. It's
No.
like rough and real. And it is when we meet life as it is.
Yeah.
The fire comes through and we stand tall, we meet it, or we fall, whatever happens, happens. But I think we can trust that, you know, there's something that's being released in us. And I certainly feel this because I wrote this book and in fact that poem in the midst of a very, very deep grief. I had just lost my mother the year before. I was like scheduled to work on this book and, had a contract to make this book. And there were so many days I woke up and I thought, there's no way. How can I help
Yeah.
anybody else? Because it's taking all I have to get out of bed and go for a little walk in the woods or something. And yet it was the steady chipping away, and trusting that I think not even consciously that there were seeds in me that were being released by this terrible experience because my mother and I were very close. And so, in a way, up to the point that she passed away, that was one of the worst things that I could imagine happening.
That's it.
And it
That's
happened.
it.
And it
Yeah.
happened. And because that is often the case, that the worst things that we can imagine do happen. And I don't say that to be morbid or dark. It's how life unfolds sometimes. And so, we have a choice. Do we shut down? Do we numb? Or do we open to this experience? And, I feel very lucky, probably like you, Wendy, that I had the meditation and the spiritual practice to kind of buttress me up at this time in my life. And I also had the writing practice. And frankly, neither of them was quote unquote going well in the midst of this deep grief. It didn't feel good to
Yeah.
just sit with all these crazy emergency mode kind of thoughts that were going through me. And the writing that I was doing felt very flat and very
Right.
uninspired in a way. But I kept showing up because I knew that it was a process of kind of diving down deeper beneath the layers and getting to those seeds that were buried very deep in me that were wanting to be released. And if I am having a moment right now and sort of engaged in this creative flow, I think it is only because I was able to stand with those fires as they were passing through me. And, you know, the funny thing is with rough grace is that it doesn't always happen in just one fell swoop. It's like,
No.
this happens and then this happens and then you lose a friendship and then you lose a job and then you give up this. And, it is insane how this sort of chaotic transformative storm can happen in your life. And I think that's why I built and created this book because it gave me this sense of structure. That's probably why I
Yeah.
started with courage and vulnerability too, because that's what I needed the most at that time, and that's probably why that part speaks to you the most. But I needed like, okay, today I need help with self-compassion. So that's why, one of the parts is self-compassion.
Right.
Today, I'm feeling like a little bit of wonder and awe for the world again, even though I have this deep grief. It's like the lights shining through on the wall and just kind of sliding down the wall. And I'm like, I didn't even know that could happen, like in this house. I've never seen that. So, like, just being alive to these little moments were really helpful. And I think that's why I wanted to create the opportunity for those same moments to visit with other readers as they were reading through. And I want to say, people can read through this very passively. I think you'll absorb
Sure.
a lot. You'll still do that. Or, you can take it seriously and you can work with it. I have another student, her name's Deborah, and she's like, I have been working with this book the same way Wendy said it too. Like, I have been working almost like, it's like slightly like, why did you give me so much homework with this
Yeah,
book?
it's kind of like you dog you. Yeah.
You're right, exactly. But I think you can choose to go down that route, and it may be dependent on whatever is going on in your life. You may have the space and time for a deep dive, or you might just have space and time, like people have told me, I read one a day, or I read one a week, or whatever speed. It's not like a novel where you have to like keep at it. You can open it up wherever the page lands, and there might be something for you that day.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Um, I don't know what your schedule is like because we have more to talk about, more readings. Do you have a little time?
Mhm.
Because we got off on some things here,
I
on
love it.
so which is typical. So since we're talking about the courage and vulnerability section, since it's my favorite, I couldn't pick just one for you to read. So could you read? Well, you actually already read one, so then we're up to three now. So I'm going to two more. Um, could you, for us, read Trust and Prayer to be Changed? And we can pause between a minute or two to talk about the poem a little
Mhm.
without spending too much time. But those two really hit me. So if you could.
Absolutely. So this one is trust. Though I may not feel it yet today, I want to be as brave as the tiny merganser duckling, who, as soon as he chips his way through the cracking egg, must leap from the old woodpecker hole high up in a tree where his mother chose to hide her nest lined in feather down. I want to leave all safety behind and trust that the ground will hold me, that my body was built for risks like this. Even while falling through empty air, let me believe I will bounce back, still as resilient as that first moment my unsteady feet touched the earth.
That's a beautiful poem, and just your description of the duckling, just it was scary. I mean, I felt, do you
Yeah,
know what I mean? That was
yeah.
very scary, reminds me of a Zen story about going to the top of the 100-foot pole and then taking a step.
Mm,
It's
mm,
similar kind of thing.
yeah.
It's that trust that whatever. It's not the trust that something good will happen. It's just the trust that something needs to happen next, I think.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. And I think so often we just don't have a sense of what that needs to be. And sometimes it requires a leap, however small or however large. And my husband and I were just watching a nature show and we saw these little merganser ducklings jumping down,
Jeez.
bouncing. Like how can their bodies sustain this? But they're just bouncing on the earth. They're built for taking these risks and leaps like this. So I just thought this has to be a poem because I feel like those little ducklings some mornings and they're just leaping right out into the open air and letting the ground meet them
That's a
wherever.
wonderful image, and it'll stick with me a lot. And it'll probably be it'll probably buoy me during scary circumstances. So it's
Yeah.
excellent. And then the next one was I really liked the prayer to be changed because I kept saying a prayer to be changed from my fear prior to ending up in the hospital, but didn't really believe it could happen.
Mm.
So I like this poem.
And it happened, right? And I think this poem speaks to a lot of people because you realize it just takes a little shift in
It's
your thinking,
it's shift in
right?
perspective, right? Exactly.
Yeah. So this is prayer to be changed. I ask for just the slightest shift in my thinking, the kindest sifting of my busy mind, so only wonder and peace are left behind. So that as I walk in sleet on this spring morning, I can see even these muddy ruts made by careless trucks on the forest trail as harbors of miracle, knowing they will fill with enough snow melt and rain for tadpoles to swim in come summer, until that sun-lit instant when they feel the flexing of legs in the water beneath them and leap out onto the ground, their bodies having decided by pure instinct alone to be soft and alive in this world.
Where that tadpole story was such a surprise. It was like
Hmm.
a turn in a sonnet, It's like
Yeah.
I was like, where did you get that one?
Well, I think that speaks to what we were saying earlier, this idea of staying open to surprise, whether you're sitting in meditation or you're writing, that constant curiosity and being open and not knowing what I'm going to write because I sit down thinking like this just started with I asked for just the slightest shift in my thinking because I was not in a good mood. I think it was like Easter morning.
Yeah.
It was sleety, gray, rainy day. I think my mother was pretty sick at this point, so I was really feeling for her. And then I began just thinking about these muddy ruts, and it's like they're ugly. I resent these trucks that made them. Like, how dare they? But it's like, oh yeah, that I find a lot of tadpoles in these ruts when summer, late spring and summer happens. And so then my mind just went off from there. And maybe it says something that both of these poems include these kind of major leaps, at least for these small creatures, right? A
Yeah,
leap from the tree, a leap out of the puddle onto
and
solid ground.
and finding that they had legs, I mean, that was a very
Yeah.
awesome image. Yeah, so I love that. Um, And then the self-compassion and release section, which you spoke to earlier, really is a deeply healing section. One of the poems speaks so clearly to me about a type of healing most of us need at one time or another. Would you please read After Burnout?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I will say too, this will be corrected in future editions, but there's a mistake. There's actually a missing line at the end of this poem. And so I'll fill it in for you.
However, it doesn't read like there's anything missing.
I know, isn't it funny how that works? And so anyway, I'll just go ahead and read it as it is, and then we can talk about that and why that might be the case. So this is After Burnout. You finally decide to do no more than is necessary, relishing each new gulp of air drawn into your lungs, when out of the flavorless mush of days, even weeks without sun, it happens again. Life calls you back. With a hint of chocolate in the cup of coffee taken alone at the table, or the needles of coneflower seeds sticking to your fingertips as you spread them around in autumn earth. How all living things want to go on, attaching themselves to whatever body or breath of wind will carry them home. Now stop in the driveway and listen as amber gold leaves, one by one, break off with a simple snap of stem from branch. That sound just shy of silence, saying to you, it's time to release all the relentless reaching for the light. Rest is not death, though it may feel like it at first.
I love that end. How could it get better? Rest is not death. I mean,
I
that
know.
that says it
Yeah.
all right there.
So what happened? I would love to blame my publisher for this. Unfortunately, I cannot because
It
this is
was
my
you.
fault. I was monkeying with the end, and I think, I just forgot to include that last line because I thought rest is not death, period. It can just end there.
Yes.
But I wanted to like there was a little more gentle quality that I wanted to add. Though it may feel like it at first. When you really start to rest, you feel restless.
Yes.
You're like, wait, what's happened? I need noise, I need activity. So that's the kind of thing that I was trying to suggest. But I think you're absolutely right, Wendy. Rest is not death, full stop.
Yeah.
Like it's okay to rest. People will still remember you. Like life will still be going on when you reemerge. So I went back and forth on this, and the publisher just was like, "Oh, that looks finished. Okay." So nobody caught that I forgot that final line.
You're okay. Well, you're not going to tell us. We'll wait until you have another edition. Is that it? What the last line
What
is?
what's in the published book, and maybe you got one of the corrected versions, but what's in the published book is just rest is not death.
Oh no,
And
I got the corrected version.
oh, you did.
Yeah,
Okay.
it says
Oh,
although it feels like it sometimes. I think yeah.
yeah, though it may feel like it at first.
First, yeah, no,
Yeah.
no,
Okay.
it's yeah. Oh no, I didn't. Rest is not death,
Oh,
and it ends with a comma. I should have noticed that.
yeah. I should have too.
I'm sorry. It's
Yeah.
you because you read, although it feels like it first.
Yeah,
That's
I
why
read
I thought,
that last
yeah,
line.
that's
Yeah.
awesome. Yeah, that's a great one. Um, Another in that section that fills me with hope and delight because I have the same feeling about the beech trees in spring
Mm.
as around here we have oak trees that they hold on to their leaves. And I used to say that every time I walked, I would hear the applause of oak tree leaves because they just constantly were clapping and all through the winter, right? So um, I would love you to read it only, not because it has anything to do with anything we've been talking about, but because I love the sound of it.
Mm.
It
Well, thank
it's
you. Yeah.
sounds beautiful.
Yeah. Well, and I think it does have a little something. This idea of holding on to something, sort of
Holding
like
on.
you were talking about with your fear, and even with grief sometimes, we don't always want to let go of grief or sorrow, and it's not like you ever let go of it completely, but these habits that we build up around it. So anyway, this is Beech Trees in Spring. I want to be like the maples, letting go so easily of their leaves in the slightest autumn breeze, surrendering every piece of themselves they no longer need, and embracing bareness like a new suit they can simply step into. But I'm more like the beech trees, which cling to the husks of their leaves long into spring, refusing to give up even a scrap of who they once were until the last possible minute. Perhaps they need the reassurance, or maybe they're here to lend music to the silence of winter, leaves beaten thin as tissue paper rustling, a lonely chorus in the snow-covered woods, until buds push up to the surface, and with no other choice, they say yes to the final scatter and release, learning again, as if for the first time, how loss leaves room for something new.
Well, amen. You're right. It did speak to everything we've been talking about. But because I was so enamored with the sound of it, I kind of
Mm,
forgot of the meaning there. Um, you know, one last thing that I wanted to talk about, and then you wanted to read a poem. But your poems are amazing tools just to dive into the wonder and openness of the everyday because, this is everyday Buddhism after all. So I
yeah,
kind of wanted to talk about the everyday because that's where you find enlightenment. You have your glimpses of 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 grace, of awakening, of in the everyday. And you kind of spoke to that, and I'm not even sure if this was the poem you were referring to, but it really captured me, Evening Light.
mm,
Because it was so everyday with what the light was shining on in your
yeah,
table or whatever. Um, so it's probably something we've all shared, and I think this is very approachable to everyone. And I really like it because I think it illustrates how we all are poets. All you have to do is look at your table as the sun's setting, right? And there it is.
that's right.
So, and we can all feel that we're poets when that happens. So that'll be the last one I ask you to read because you're probably losing your voice. Evening Light.
Okay, evening light. There is this place on the table next to the couch where light always rests at sunset, reaching through the leaves of the cherry tree to touch the keychain and calendar, the wallet and change one last time before night falls. That would make a great photo, I think. Ready to reach for my phone, move the vase of cut sunflowers closer so they too might blaze up and burn. Instead, I stay right where I am, deciding to leave the moment intact, tinged orange with smoke from wildfires up north, the whole house now held in the amber of that dying light.
And that was good also because with the wildfires, I we too had the smoke that came down
Yeah,
because we're not too far from where they were. And I remember waking up one morning and walking outside and saying, and it wasn't the smell, it was like, what's wrong with the light?
yeah.
Why does it look like this?
Yeah, it was so surreal. I mean, and
It
I think
was.
I love this poem. I mean, I don't know if you're supposed to say that about your own poems, but
Yay.
I love this poem because, there it's just like you're saying, it's this really everyday moment, and that's what I'm always trying to teach the folks in my community or, through my newsletter. It's just these everyday moments of illumination. That is what we have. And so there's the pleasure of that, noticing what the Japanese call komolebe, the
Yeah.
light that falls through the leaves. And then there's this worry, there's this fear, like wildfire smoke that's actually making this light even more intense. And so, it's all of these kind of the pleasure, the joy, the wonder, the fear, the anger, like everything
Yeah.
kind of coexisting in this moment. And I think even like a wistfulness, because how many times more will I be here to notice this? How many more times will I pause to actually take this in? So I'm really glad you pointed to that poem, Wendy.
Yeah, and then the miracle of it, even with all the 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 worry of the wildfires and everything, it was it was the wallet and the keys on the table where the
Yeah,
evening light. I mean, that is brilliant. I just have to say. So
Mm,
that's a fave.
thank you.
So you said you had a poem you wanted to read,
That's
and
right.
it's only fair because I've asked you to read like eight of them, I think.
Well, I'm a poet after all. That is what we do. So I'm happy to do it. But I wanted to share this poem, in part because I shared it with a group that I was leading recently, and I had never read it out loud, actually, I realized. And so I shared it with them, and I was talking about just this embodied experience of spring in the Arboretum with a dear friend of mine. And they ended up writing these really embodied, very deep poems to the invitation that comes along with this one. And I'll just say, um, basically, the invitation is to just describe a time when you kind of swept aside your own obligations and said yes to like pleasure or joy or whatever, like, no, I want to do this. So this is called Necessary Beauty. Though we had suitcases to pack and bags of dog food to haul home, it was necessary for us to drive instead toward the Arboretum, where lilacs at last in bloom filled the evening air with their perfume. It was necessary to get out of the car, kick off our shoes, and walk barefoot onto the steaming, sun-warmed mulch among the bushes. To take a blossom-heavy branch in each hand and inhale deeply so we could breathe again after the longest winter in memory. It was necessary to close our eyes and sigh, to see what had been driving the bees so wild all day, making them dance above us as we collapsed in the dewy grass, half high on that commonplace scent of spring we'd find hours later, clinging to our shirts, our skin, our hair.
That's beautiful. And I'm in Rochester, which is the home
Mhm.
of the Lilac Festival. I don't know if
Oh, I didn't
anybody
know
knows
that.
that. We have like one of the most
Oh.
beautiful parks around here. It's full of wonderful, all sorts of species of lilacs. And when we moved into this house and yard, there was a lilacs all across the backyard.
Hmm.
And it's like I remember every spring thinking, um, coming out of the, gray marble sameness of winter. And then there was this scent, it was like, oh my goodness. So I really felt that completely.
Yeah,
Um,
it's this exuberance, and I think, this poem kind of carries its own invitation. So if you
yeah,
have any listeners out there who are interested in writing, just use that phrase that it was necessary.
it
It
was
was
necessary.
necessary. See
Yeah.
what comes for you.
Yeah, and because the tension there is necessary versus the non-necessary thing you just
That's right.
did. Yeah,
That's
and that's
right.
what's awesome about it. So
Yeah.
yeah, the listeners write something there. So James, again, there's so much more we could talk about. I kept you way too long. So I don't want to take any more of your time. And of course, I'll post links to where listeners can learn about you, your writing and editing, your readings, and how you can sign up for your free weekly poems and writing prompts at your website, which I'll put there. It's actually just jamescruz.net. Um, but before we close, is there anything else you'd like to mention?
I think I just want to say a big thank you to you, Wendy, for initiating this conversation, for giving so much attention to this book and letting it work through you, because I've been dreaming of this book for probably a decade now, and it finally came to fruition, and it's so useful to know that it is being used by folks like you. And it feels like we've only been talking for 15 minutes. So thank you so much for this lively conversation too.
Okay, James, as always, and the promise is he'll be back.
That's
So thanks again, James. Have a good day.
Thank you, Wendy.
Next up, some plugs and reminders. Consider subscribing to my Substack to receive continuing chapters of the book Living Life as It Is, a personal narrative of my transformation through the pandemic. Links to the Substack are in the show notes. And if you subscribe, not only will you get the serial book postings, but also the Words from My Teachers podcast every week in your email. Support my Dharma work for only $5 a month or $40 annually. Next up are the new announcements for Patreon supporters. Relatively new. We've talked about this before, but if you never listened to the end before, we've opened up the community through Patreon. Patreon will make it more open and accessible for all supporters of this podcast who might like a place to hang out with others. Membership tiers have lower suggested donations, and one tier includes a free subscription to the Everyday Buddhism Substack, where you'll find my new book as serial posts, my weekly podcast, Words from My Teachers, a Zen koans for Everyday section, and other articles and practice areas, including a guided meditation area. I hope you check out the new Patreon community, where we have many places for discussion and the ability to join the once monthly Everyday Sangha on the first Saturday of the month at 10 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time, plus a drop-in gathering on the third Saturday at 10 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time. You can support this podcast and the other activities of Everyday Buddhism by becoming a Patreon supporter. If you don't follow me or Everyday Buddhism on any social media platforms we post in, you can go to the Everyday Buddhism website and become a member by joining the Patreon community. Just go to the www.everyday-buddhism.com website and click on the link that says membership. Or you can join directly through Patreon at patreon.com/everydaybuddhism. Links to joining are posted in the show notes. I thank all of you who contribute. This podcast, the community, and the Sangha depend on your donations to continue to exist. I never seek podcast sponsors and don't ask for financial commitments through a paid podcast membership. So my work and the cost needed to support what I do is entirely self-funded except for your donations. Please consider a one-time or continuing donation through Patreon or my website's Donate tab. Or you could buy me a coffee on the coffee cup link on the website. You can find all these links in the show notes. Another way you can help is to rate and review the podcast on your favorite podcast platform. It really is important to share the podcast with others. Nobody knows it exists unless they see a friend, a family member, or a stranger recommend the podcast on the platform. So if you find this podcast helpful in your life, please rate and review. And if you could, don't just rate, but take a moment to comment so people will know why you love Everyday Buddhism. That's it for the announcements today. So until next time, keep finding ways to make yours and everyone's days better.